Good evening, and thank you for joining us for NCEA's Leadership Succession Planning in Catholic Education, Developing an Ongoing Plan webinar. My name is Kate Reich, and I am the organizer for this evening's event. Before we begin, please know that all of your microphone connections have been muted. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please send those through the question box that appears in your GoToWebinar panel. To ask a question, use your mouse and click into the blank box area, type your question using your keyboard, and then click Send. The webinar presentation will last 45 minutes, and any questions that you have asked will be addressed in the remaining time. Later this evening, you will receive an email asking you to complete a brief evaluation about this webinar as well as information about creating a certificate of attendance. I thank you in advance for providing us with feedback about today's event. We will also be sending you another email with instructions on accessing this recorded webinar and presentation files in another business day or two. Now I'm very happy to introduce Christopher Cosentino, Interim Director of NCEA's Secondary Schools Department, who would like to share just a few words with you. Please welcome Chris.
Welcome, everyone. I appreciate that you're all able to join us this evening for this very important webinar and the great information that you will gain from it. Before I introduce our speakers, though, I want to share some upcoming professional development opportunities for all of you. Our annual national convention will be held from April 7th through the 9th in Orlando, Florida. If you haven't yet, please take time to go to our website and register for the convention. I'd also like to mention our Wisdom and Witness Symposium, which is at the University of Dayton from June 25th through the 27th. And again, you can find more information how to register for that symposium on our website. But at this time, I would just like to introduce our two speakers this evening. We have Sister Mary Fitzgerald, who is an assistant professor at Notre Dame of Maryland University, and Dr. Anthony Sabatino, who is the clinical associate professor at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. The topic tonight is a very important issue for all Catholic school leaders, and we appreciate Sister Mary and Dr. Sabatino sharing their insights and thoughts. And I would encourage everyone listening in on the webinar to please take time to look in our publications section for their book on this topic, which is just invaluable to all of us. So at this time, again, I would like to turn it over to Sister Mary and Dr. Sabatino and thank them again for presenting tonight.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everyone. We'd like to try to speak with you tonight to share some ideas on preparing for your next leader, and we want to set the basis within our Catholic tradition. Our baptismal call commissions us to do the work of God, to take the mission of God, to shed God's love and God's salvation through all the earth. We do that in our Catholic education. It's a very daunting task in many ways, and we need leaders who are extremely well qualified to do that. It's a very different picture today than it was 50 or 60 years ago, and it's very important, as Jim Collins tells us, to have the right person in the right seat on the bus at all times, because that's the person who's driving the bus. Catholic school leaders today have a complicated life and many duties to fulfill. Tony?
What we intend to do during the webinar is to present to you this picture of when we thought, Mary and I, about our book, and when we thought about this webinar, we referred to the Gospel of Matthew 25:14-30, the parable of the talents. And are we then that person who is investing in the future, or are we the person who's burying those talents because we're afraid to think about a vision or afraid to move our institution forward without us? Something that we're going to be very clear about as we proceed throughout the webinar is that as we put our book together, and as you see the title of it in this next slide, something that was mindful in our work was that we did not necessarily want to replace the work of an outside consultant, but what we wanted to do was prepare schools in thinking about how to put together a leadership succession plan on their own. And what are those important elements that are in place prior to the departure of a leader. And we're going to address both of those in this webinar briefly, but certainly you'll find them in this book that we've provided for your use. Again, what we're going to do is spend time on concept and method. We're going to address both in this webinar, but again, it's an overview, and it's not as in depth perhaps as you would find it in a book, but certainly we're going to do our best to give you this information. So our intention then is to discuss this feature of being visionary and being a proactive leader. So if you're in the audience tonight and you are in a leadership position and you are knowing that perhaps you are leaving that role, what would be the steps that you would want to take to make sure that the future of your school is in good hands? Or are you just closing the door on the last day, walking out and not thinking about that school community again? But for most of us who have committed ourselves to lives of Catholic education, we don't think that way. It is our way to be visionary and to be concerned about the community we work in, and to want it to flourish after our time has gone. Mary?
The origin of the book actually came from NCEA itself, and it came out of the Secondary Schools Executive Committee. NCEA was committed to publishing something along this topic because there are books out there, but they're done for business. We have a unique feature in that we're Catholic schools, and we needed to bring that in as well. So one of the things that we hope with the book as you go through it is that you will find the materials in the back extremely helpful to you. We have interview questions, we have outline of time, we have outlines of the national standards, Catholic standards and benchmarks, et cetera, et cetera. We have to give a word of gratitude to Father Tom Elowat, who provided us with many, many templates for writing letters and so on.
Mary?
This quotation that you see in front of you right now from Alan Heyman, who was, or at least in 2003, he was the Director of Leadership Training for the Department of Defense's Education Equity Division. And he gave this in a personal communication to the authors of the book, The New Principles Field Book. But Tony and I both like this quotation. We feel that it is very accurate. Remember that real leadership is what remains after the leader has left. We'd like to suggest that the difference in whether leadership is going to continue when a leader leaves or not has to do with the style of leadership that the person who is leaving has had. On the one hand, a leader can take the time to facilitate, foster, and support leadership in all constituencies of the school. And that can be risky, and Tony will address that a little bit later. But it can also be very productive. If a leader's fostered leadership in all constituencies, the members of the constituencies have bought into the mission of the school, and they will lead effectively in the leader's absence. But, and this is a very important but, in fostering leadership in others, a leader needs to, in Jim Collins' words, conduct autopsies without blame. We have all had experiences, I'm sure, I could almost place a wager on this, that everyone listening has had an experience of having begun some type of a project and had it flop in some way, shape, or form, or something went wrong with it. And when we empower others to take over leadership, we have to be ready for that eventuality, and we have to be ready to help them to pick up the pieces and move on. So conducting the autopsy does not mean placing blame on them. It means looking at the situation and saying, well, is this salvageable? How can we improve this? What can we do better along these lines? On the other hand, if we choose to be autocratic and hold all the leadership to ourselves, we may feel as if, well, I know what I'm doing. I'm not sure that so-and-so will know what he or she is doing if I give them the job. When we leave, no one has had leadership developed, and there's no leadership that rises to take over. Tony?
So what we intend to do is in this first part of our presentation, speak about the preparation itself and the planning. So when we think about leadership succession planning. There's the mechanics that kick in when a leader leaves, but what is the proactive work that a school and a school leader or the school governance engages in to find this next leader when, in fact, the leader has decided or someone else has decided that that leader will leave. So as you see on the slide, as something critical to our presentation is the idea that schools need to be strategically thinking about their future. Now, many of you have engaged in strategic planning, and you understand the difference between that and an accreditation plan. So one thinks about strategic thinking in the model of the preferred future. What is it that you as the leader have envisioned as the preferred future of the school? And is that the same vision that is shared by others in your school? And so where are you as a community in this idea of strategically thinking about a preferred future for your school?
When we put our work together, it was very important to us to have data to back up anything that we wanted to say, and we wanted it to be current data. And so we sent surveys out to all across the nation to superintendents, superiors of religious communities with formal teaching missions, and to chairs of the boards of directors or trustees of all the Catholic schools across the nation. We find this particular slide to be very encouraging. It indicates that we are servicing a broad-based population despite the fact that all of our schools are either tuition-driven and or dependent upon philanthropic support. Tony?
What we also found in this, and as we looked at that, as you know, that from looking at the percentages, as we surveyed superintendents, they serve within their diocese many different identities of schools and locations, rural, urban, suburban, and inner city. And with that said, we think about the context of the individual school, and it may be that a given leader has been in a school community for a significant period of time and is very much a part of that local culture. It may be that a school leader has only been there for, let's say, a 5-year period. So each of these contexts develops, and if you were thinking about jotting a few notes, develops their own beliefs, attitudes, and skills that would be necessary for the continuation of the mission of their school. And so what would those be, those key beliefs and attitudes and skills that are definitely, certainly a part of who we are in Catholic education in general, but what are those unique beliefs and attitudes and skills that would be necessary for your own context, your own community? Mary? I guess that this is me, isn't it, Mary?
This is you.
So what we did further in the study, as we surveyed superintendents, and what you'll see is that a little bit more than 60% of the superintendents that we surveyed had public school experience in their career. Not all of them came directly into the superintendency from public schooling. But what we do know is that there are many people that serve within our Catholic schools as teachers, as principals, as superintendents who have had public school experience. And we honor that experience as a level of professionalism that truly gives us a picture of knowledge, skills, and a disposition that leads to professional excellence and certainly it improves student learning. But when we hire, when we're thinking about the next leader in our context, how do we assist our leaders in incorporating this Catholic identity into their professional practice? So if they're coming to us from public schools, how do we then, as those who are currently leading, or in our future understanding of who's going to lead, how do we respond to someone who brings to us a high level of professional competency but little experience in Catholic schooling? So another topic that raises itself in planning for the next leader.
As we look at the data on the next slide, the thing that excites us is how many people report that they do have some type of an emergency plan in place to replace a leader. 42.3%, and 46.2% say that they have a plan for developing leaders. The information is really good, but we don't know what percentage of the plans are diocesan templates as contrasted with plans already tailored to the individual school. And Tony and I see the latter as the ideal. When you have a plan, it should be individually tailored to your school. We need people to be 100% prepared on both issues, an emergency plan and a plan for leadership development. And we need 100% of our people to have these plans in place. Tony?
Something that we thought might be interesting to do, and we put up a slide with the ocean, and certainly Mary on the Atlantic and I on the Pacific refer to the calming sense of what the water can bring us. But that calming sense doesn't necessarily associate itself with leadership change. And so what we thought about at this time is, and we know that we have limited amounts of time, but that we would just sit back for a second and allow you to think about what leadership change has been in your life. Perhaps you've been engaged yourself in changing leadership positions. Perhaps you have witnessed leadership change that was either very healthy for the school environment because perhaps it was dysfunctional to begin with and the new leader brought new life and refreshment. But perhaps it was a situation where your school was well organized and in harmony, and the new leader came in and created dysfunction and created disharmony. And in many cases, it has to do with this notion of preparing for leadership change. And sometimes what we do is we kind of are much like the ostrich, and we put our head in the sand, and we don't want to face the inevitability of change, and the inevitability in this case in leadership change. So maybe at this point we'd just like to ask you to think a little bit about your own experiences, and we suspect that you've had many of them when you think about leadership change. And we heard, believe it or not, even though it was muted, we heard several screams from the audience because we know that some of those situations have not been happy. And yet, I'm sure that from your experiences, there have been those that have worked out quite well. Maybe you were the agent of change that came in and calmed a very difficult situation. But the rest of our webinar is going to be focused on what you see as our learning objectives. And as you can tell, we want to be able to begin this definition for you, and we do have a definition to give you that you can bring back to your school communities as you begin to write your plan. And so we have a definition of leadership succession planning. Again, identifying ways to develop leadership capacity from within, connecting the importance of quality leadership attitudes, indicators of readiness for strategic planning and for developing a leadership succession plan, and identifying key steps in the process for the planning.
So our first webinar objective is to articulate a working definition of leadership succession planning. And for those of you who are exhausted because you've just completed the end of a long day at work and you think, I can't do another thing today, I can't think of another thought, you're in luck because, as Tony told you, we have written one for you. So Tony will flip to that now.
If you've explored the national standards and benchmarks for effective Catholic elementary and secondary schools, you've noticed that there's a link as of December at the very top that says resources. And in that resources link is a guidebook for each of the standards and the 70 benchmarks of the national standards and benchmarks. So I served on that committee, on that steering committee that organized that guidebook, and one of the added features to that resource is a glossary of terms. And the National Standards and Benchmarks movement has utilized this definition from the work that Sister Mary and I have put together in that leadership succession book. And we cover, the protocol and process in this book, but certainly we cover three what we find to be distinct elements of leadership succession. The emergency replacement of a leader, the development of leadership capacity, and the response to a planned, or even in some cases an unplanned, replacement of a leader. So we're going to address all three of those, and perhaps at this time, Mary, you can begin our discussion of emergency replacement.
Mm-hmm. Well, people leave positions for a variety of reasons, and the departure may be an emergency such as death, serious illness, military reassignment, or hopefully this will never happen to us, but maybe the leader gets arrested for immorality or something. The departure may also be unplanned. The leader may have expected to fulfill his or her duties for the entire year, but learns that the spouse has been transferred to North Dakota, and this will be effective in 2.5 months. The leader's departure may also be planned. The leader may have informed the board that the upcoming school year will be his or her last in the position, or the board may have told the leader that the upcoming year will be his or her last in the position. This gives the governing body time to ensure that the protocol and process for planning for the next leader are followed effectively. But what about that case of emergency replacement of the leader? We have some questions for you on this slide, and I just invite you to take a look at some of those questions because they go behind the issue of replacing a leader in an emergency situation. There are implications for the school and the community it serves. How do people respond? How do the students respond? How do the parents respond? What are some of the questions that they bring to all of the administrators in the school? What practical steps are in place in managing the immediate loss of the school's leader? Where are the keys to the school? Who has the passwords to applications, accounts, and devices? And after the immediate reaction of the loss, what steps are in place to support all the constituencies of the school? We would suggest to you that we might need counselors to assist with the school community in an emergency situation. And we also need to consider very carefully as leaders, how will we keep the school running as normally as possible? Practical considerations might include, might we need to do a press release? Who is authorized to do that? That certainly should be the head of the school with assistance from perhaps the diocese or from someone who is skilled in writing press releases. How do we identify how the person's jobs are to be completed? Who's going to take over? Who's going to get the job done? And then the other questions of how do we contact our key constituencies, the board, the diocese, the religious community, and so on. Tony? I'm sorry, I continue.
That's okay, Mary. I was just going to comment on the emergency replacement. Serving on a board of a large Catholic high school here in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and prior to joining the board, a directive in the strategic plan was leadership succession planning. And the president of the school is a seasoned administrator and soon will be retiring. So the schedule for what Mary is going to cover next in the plan replacement had already begun to be discussed. But in the idea of leadership succession planning, when I joined the board, I asked them about the very questions that Mary has asked us to consider in the emergency replacement of a leader. And we said, do we know where the keys are? And it was an interesting experience to meet with the president of the school to go through a long list of where those keys are, where the passwords are, the accounts, the devices, and it wasn't just in one person's mind, but who in the organizational chart would know where all that information is. And so that the examination of that and then meeting with the key people became a very important piece of leadership succession planning when we think about the emergency replacement of the leader. Mary, on the plan replacement?
Of course, another connection with the emergency replacement of a leader or an unplanned replacement of a leader is we spoke earlier about the importance of developing leadership within the constituencies of the school. And if leadership has been developed within the constituencies, then there are people prepared to keep the ship afloat. We may even be able to appoint an interim person based upon the leadership experience that people have had. So it's a good thought to keep in mind. With reference to a planned replacement of a leader, the questions remain the same, but there is not the same sense of urgency because we do have time to make sure a decent plan is in place and we're moving along with that plan. Tony?
And this is where I think it was something like 95% of the superintendents already indicated that there is a process and protocol that schools can use from the template that's given from the diocese in a planned replacement. But what's so interesting, we had a question after the end of the first webinar for a pastor who was very concerned about justice and faith, identity of the person who's coming in as the next leader, and was wondering how important was that in the selection process. Well, I offered just another experiential story. I served on a search committee for a Catholic elementary school not far from our university, and joined that search committee in its first meeting with the pastor. And so there were parents, there were teachers, there were consultative board members, and then myself from the university. And the very first thing that the pastor talked about was, here's the template from the archdiocese. So we had that in front of us. And what we began to do was contextualize everything that was listed on that template. What was important to the school? What was important in its future, as we discussed earlier? What were those key elements of the next leader, that we needed to find in those applicants that were coming to us for interview? So the next item on the list for us this evening is to talk about, as we've now begun to, our exploration of those three deciding elements of leadership succession planning when we think about emergency, planned, unplanned, and now developing leaders from within, developing leadership capacity from within our schools. So we think about developing leadership capacity, and I meant Mary and I, Sister Mary and I, because that's our job. That's what we do at our university. We're both engaged in leadership preparation programs. But what happens in the life of a school when you have someone who's already a vice principal that you would like to see become a principal in your diocese? What about somebody who's teaching in the classroom or who's done some specialty work for you that you know that they begin to be very, very, very committed to the life of your school, and you see that they have leadership characteristics and you would like to see them engaged in making that decision and going through a prep program. So what are the implications for a school and the community it serves in developing leadership capacity from within? What are the practical steps? And someone asked us, what's it take in terms of a budget item in your, as you construct your budget for next year, to promote people in this idea of accepting added leadership? So it could be adding on additional or adding some release time to an individual's schedule so that they can serve in a leadership capacity. It might be cultivating from a board's perspective additional funds to actually have a full-time vice principal. Or it might be that you just give them duties in your accreditation process and reward them, financially, but also with some release time. Sending people to workshops, leadership workshops, or through, like at our university, we have a certificate in Catholic School Administration. So thinking about those practical steps means some budget line items that need to be addressed. What policies and procedures are in your faculty handbook that encourage people in leadership preparation? And what financial resources, as we just mentioned, can you bring to the table to encourage people to engage in this type of preparation?
And a very practical step, which probably wouldn't cost you a cent, would be something that the public school systems call professional learning communities. Richard Dufour has written a lot on it recently. Educational Update, the ASCD publication, has been following up on this as well. But in professional learning communities, your teachers and faculty come together to discuss issues of importance to them, of significance to them, for the improvement of student learning in the school. And as those groups get together, it doesn't take long before an administrator can really identify who the natural leaders are within those groups. And then the question becomes encouraging them to take greater leadership roles as they move along. So collaborative models of leadership are really critical to that whole process.
This next slide is, and maybe we can talk through it versus taking some moments of reflection just for the sake of time. But one of the issues that confronts both Mary and I as we had been thinking about this idea of strengthening the developmental process of encouraging people to take on leadership or to actually engage in leadership in the school is this: sometimes there's some serious fears by the current leader in promoting that, and one needs to come to grips with that. There's no question that you may have, or we have no doubt that many of you in the audience, if not all of us, have had some experiences with some overly ambitious person. And so there's fear engaged in our thinking about cultivating leadership from within. And yet we need to overcome that and be secure in our own roles to be able to identify those who can step forward in our absence when we are no longer the leader of the school. Mary?
Well, we wanted to share with you some professional development resources, and I'm sure that most of you are already very well aware of them. Certainly we put them in alphabetical order here, I believe, not quite, but at any rate, we put Association for the Study of Curriculum Development at the top, but we would all agree that the National Catholic Educational Association is our first recourse as we try to look for development resources, professional development resources. But if you're not familiar with the Association for the Study of Curriculum Development, they do a wonderful job. You get emails from them with information. You get a publication called Educational Leadership, another one called Educational Update, many yearbooks that they give out through the course of the year, which are actually the research that different educators have done and the conclusions that they've come to. It is very well worth the subscription price. I'm sure most of you who work at the elementary level are aware of NAESP, and at the secondary level you're aware of NASSP. And then in addition, anyone who's working in some of the more affluent areas, or even not necessarily so, but you may be very well aware of the National Association of Independent Schools. All of these organizations provide us with phenomenal resources for professional development. And once we have the memberships in them, a lot of them are coming to us as a service. Tony?
So the next item on the list for us this evening is, as you see on the slide, connecting the importance of quality leadership attitudes and skills with the mission of Catholic education. And so what we're stepping into at this moment is to think about those qualities and characteristics that are very important to us as we begin to idealize, so to speak, a listing of those for our next leader. Sometimes we think about ourselves in that role as let's clone us for the next leader. And is that exactly what is our role in this, in working with a governance model, or in our particular school, a governance group? Are we the cloning? Are we to just replicate ourselves, or are we looking for the next leader who will move the school community forward? And one of the items that both of us, Mary and I, had thought about was to give our own reflections on leadership. And just on mine, it says, the purpose or mission of Catholic education establishes the worldview of the context that influences the decisions of the Catholic school leader. And what does that mean? It means that is this next leader someone who fully embraces and understands the educational mission of the church and incorporates that into the decisions that they're making, so that there is a worldview of how we're progressing our schools as they move forward. Mary?
And I had a similar thought in mind, that the vision of the leader today is inadequate if it's not global. Where are we in terms of understanding other cultures? What do we understand about people in the various countries of Africa, or about the Muslim community? How do we differentiate the true Muslim goal from the extremists? How do we educate our children about that? How do we come forward with a sense of respect and yet a sense of justice and peace, and move the school and the students forward in terms of global awareness. We do it, I think, by building a faith community, and that's
Absolutely.
the most important key to our school. Pope Francis has a beautiful paragraph in Evangelii Gaudium, his apostolic exhortation of last year, or 2 years ago, I guess. He says, Catholic schools, which always strive to join their work of education with the explicit proclamation of the gospel, are a most valuable resource for the evangelization of culture, even in those countries and cities where hostile situations challenge us to greater creativity in our search for suitable methods. So again, as global educators, how do we keep seeking out this greater creativity which enables us to be the educators that we need to be for the children who will be the leaders of tomorrow?
So what we did in the next part of this slide is to reflect, and there were 4 fundamental bullets that were gleaned from our presentation from Mary and I as we gave a presentation on leadership succession last NCEA convention in 2014. And we want to just highlight the first one. The new leader is respectful of existing staff and their experiences. And so when you're thinking about preparing for the next leader, and when we think about the knowledge, skills, and dispositions of our next leader, is that person willing to understand us? Is that person willing to not only understand us, but incorporate some of themselves into our culture, but also incorporate some of our culture into them? So on this next slide, we've outlined from our discussion those 3 elements coming from Sister Mary Cirillo's work back in the 90s when she talked about Catholic school leadership as standing with a in a 3-legged stool, so to speak. What are the educational components, the instructional, educational leadership components of a leader? What are the spiritual components of a Catholic school leader? And what are those managerial skills and knowledge and dispositions of a Catholic school leader? So what we've done is to put together from our work at last year's convention and some responses from those who attended a listing of those knowledge, skills, and dispositions under those 3 specific legs of the stool: educational, spiritual, and managerial leadership. And we know that you're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint. So it's something that you might want to go back to, because it's language that you can use as you construct your own leadership succession plan, as well as your methodology in searching and seeking your next leader.
So what are some indicators that we're really ready to write a strategic plan? Well, remembering that writing a strategic plan means we are choosing our preferred future. It's really a question of visioning for our schools, and especially for our Catholic schools. The importance of having something like this in place before we hire is extremely significant, because this goes beyond the mission statement. It goes into the question of what is the vision for this school? Where do we expect this school to be in 5 years? And so therefore, if we're going to hire you, how do we expect you to lead this school for the next 5 years? It's directly related to the leadership succession plan. If we know where we want to be in 5 years, we have an idea of the qualities we need in leadership. The strategic plan actually validates our visioning and provides us with the verbiage for vision. Tony?
So we've introduced strategic planning into our conversation with you because we know that it is a common element of a strategic plan left out. And yet strategic plans speak to this repetitively. What are you as a school community doing to engage in the discovery and search and the selection of your next leader? So when we think about readiness for strategic planning, we think about strategic thinking, and when we think about strategic thinking, we're thinking about leadership succession. So, conducting the internal audit, the expectations, physical condition. You can find this work in Brother Bill Campbell's Strategic Planning Survival Guide, published through NCEA.
Now, as an aside to that, it's great to know that we need a strategic plan, but the question becomes, how effective are the strategic plans that we're writing? Do they indicate measurable objectives? If they don't, they're practically of no use because you don't have any criterion to say it was successful or not successful. Do we start with baseline data and set expectations of where we will be in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, etc.? Have we identified the persons responsible for ensuring that this happens? Have we listed personnel, material, and financial resources that will be necessary? Those are all important parts of the strategic planning process. Tony?
So the next item before we speak about the actual methodology, the timeline aspect of what happens when you trigger the plan, we decided that we would include what we would consider some questions to establish organizational readiness for the fact that you're going to need a new leader, that it's inevitable. And one of the things that came to mind to us as we did our work was that organizational charts sometimes are, in many cases actually, we discovered, are not updated. And so an organizational chart, an accurate, up-to-date organizational chart serves you well in responding to the emergency loss of a leader as well as the planned loss of a leader, as well as building leadership capacity from within, because people begin to see where they might be able to fit in as they move through the organizational structure of your school. Understanding who the official spokesperson is in your school. And in cases where there's a president and a principal, certainly that seems to be the natural, but who actually is the official spokesperson, and especially in an emergency departure? Who will serve in the interim when the leader leaves? And the identity of that person should be written into a contract. In a case that I worked with a Catholic school in this archdiocese, they hadn't actually done that. They thought that it was important to have an interim leader in case of an emergency, but they actually didn't write it into a person's contract. They went ahead and tried to do that, and the person balked at that and didn't want to be placed in that role. So it is something that you would want to think about. If you have in your organizational chart who the next leader would be in the case of an emergency, it should be written into that person's contract that they would take on that role. Is there an internal and external communication plan, and so on? And again, when you receive this webinar and you see the PowerPoint, you'll be able to refer back to these questions as you run your school community through the responses that will be necessary for developing your plan. So now we want to identify some key steps. Mary?
Well, I just wanted to go to one point that was in the previous slide, Tony. Is there a secured source for official documents, for example, board minutes, financial records, personnel records, student records, and bank accounts? We know that legally we are responsible for securing those documents. And I was aware of a school situation in which a secretary thought that the person was being very helpful by cleaning out the files and got rid of some of the records to make some more space. So we have to make sure that this kind of unintentional accident doesn't happen, that they are actually secured, that they're actually locked. And someone is responsible for the security of those, and people have to sign out to use the documents. That's all very important. Okay,
and as Mary is just talking about this critical element of succession planning, for us in Catholic schools, we are so overwhelmed with many duties as Catholic school leaders that this is one element, as we began our conversation and the discussion of this topic, that can easily be overlooked. And it's not intentionally being negligent. It is just something that happens for us. And so our intention is to raise this point of interest to all of us in Catholic education as an important element of our future. So what we have for you is a timeline, and we've constructed that, and you'll find the full timeline, and as Mary mentioned, an awful lot of information in our book. Mary?
Well, we wanted to tell you, first of all, that prior to initiating any process, there's a professional climate that needs to exist for this whole process to be very successful. Tony, I believe you wanted to say something about projecting yourself.
Yeah, recently experienced the setting where a search committee was interviewing for the first interview of a candidate for a CEO position, a president's position of the school. And it was very fascinating to observe. It was fascinating to observe this search committee and the fact that this professional climate, although the people were good and kind, there was nothing that reflected hospitality or, in fact, a professional appearance by the committee. So it's one of those issues that certainly may again escape us because we're not necessarily focusing on that level of detail. But as we think about leadership succession planning, something about written into your plan about hospitality as you're inviting candidates to your school, as well as a professional climate and atmosphere that you're conveying during interviewing, is critical to the type of candidate that's really going to be attracted to your school as a result of interviewing. Mary?
There's sometimes a mistake made among our Catholic schools that we think it's a buyer's market, that we can get just about anyone. We're going to have a lot of applicants. And when we are actually involved in the process of trying to hire another leader for a school, and we want the combination of fidelity to Catholic belief and tradition and modeling of faith, as well as the quality educational preparation, we find out that there aren't so many people out there. So we really have to get ourselves very well organized in terms of what we project and how we communicate, whether that's in letter format or on our website, what does our website look like, and so on. With the timeline that we've put before you, this is just a suggested timeline. And one of the important things on here for us is the fourth bullet down, develop board talking points. We really need to communicate to all those who are responsible for governing the school, our boards of directors and trustees, exactly what we're looking for in the candidate that we are trying to hire for a replacement for the school leader. The dates and so on these are just to give you an idea. They certainly would have to be adapted dependent upon when you go into the process, but it is just a sequence of things that needs to take place. Tony?
And I think that that's the critical element of what we have in the timeline that we've provided you just in this webinar. And of course, it's expanded in greater detail in the book. But one of the things that's important as a reminder is that, as Mary's just indicated, these are suggested timelines. But what really gets you to think about all of this as you're writing your plan is that there's a sequence to all of this, that one step follows the next. And that it's important to write this down somewhere, that it's an important idea to continually reflect on the suggested sequences that others are incorporating into their leadership succession planning. And maybe we can go, for the sake of time, Mary, we can go into, and we've included the 3-day interview process. That may not be what happens at your school, but no, clearly some of these elements are critical to the actual, not only presentation of your school, but inviting these quality candidates that you're seeking, because it is really a buyer's market. It is not a seller's market any longer. We don't have that good fortune. And so we want to attract quality people who are both Catholic in not only name but in faith, but also quality leaders. And so what we've got is a thought for you as we conclude our webinar. And I just noticed that there are no questions, so we're hoping that a few of you might have some questions for us as we conclude the webinar, but perhaps not. So Mary, would you lead us in this closing?
Yes, please. Recently, it was either in America or Commonweal, they carried a cartoon of Pope Francis speaking to Oscar Romero to tell him that he might be canonized. And Romero responded, "But what about all these other martyrs?" And a picture of about 20,000 Salvadorans appeared near him. We're very privileged to be leaders in Catholic education, but we know we could not be leaders unless there were people willing to be our co-workers. So we invite you now to call to mind all of those people in your lives, faculty, staff, students, parents, alumni, spiritual guides. Invite them to join you as you read Romero's words. You will then have 2 minutes of quiet to reflect before Tony gives you our contact information. Thank you.
So, excuse me, Tony and Sister Mary, there was a question that came in, and the question asks, this person is interested in what can be done at the diocesan level to cultivate new leadership or new leaders. I know a lot of what you talked about is at the school level, but do you have any ideas or thoughts about at the diocesan level?
Well, it would be interesting to know the perspective of the person asking the question. If it's a diocesan superintendent, then what I would indicate, at least, Mary can give her perspective. From the diocesan superintendent's position, one could make those visits, can support, first and foremost, asking principals for a list of names of people that they would believe from their school would be potential leaders. And for that superintendent to call those people, to visit with them, to go to their school and visit with them and invite them to engage in a leadership preparation program. What's been done here in this archdiocese is that the elementary superintendent has designated a person to specifically do that, because we have 220 schools in this archdiocese, but a person who actually meets with people, has scheduled 4 different gatherings throughout the year to talk about Catholic school leadership. Now, it's not a leadership preparation program, but it's that opportunity to bring people to the table of discussion so that they feel that somebody else is really thinking about their qualities and characteristics. Perhaps they've thought about it themselves, but no one's ever really affirmed it in them. And coming from a diocesan superintendent or an assistant or associate superintendent, to meet with them privately as well as to meet with them with a group of others who have been identified as future leaders is really affirming, very affirming in that process of moving forward. Now, that doesn't, again, take the place of a leadership preparation program, a professional program for Catholic school leadership, but it is one that works very well and has provided some great fruit here in this archdiocese.
I think a baseline step that could be taken at the diocesan level would be if the diocesan powers that be could create even a prayer service that's focused upon Catholic school leadership and provided the opportunity at some point in the prayer service for some faith sharing, and put that out to all the schools and encourage the principals to use it as a tool for perhaps the opening faculty meetings, the orientation, or at some point along the line. And that could be followed up with a few other activities. But I agree with Tony that I think the real clincher would be to actually have a Catholic school leadership program. They do exist in many of the universities already. If some superintendent or someone at the diocesan level wanted to do something on a much smaller scale as just a workshop type of a thing, it wouldn't have the same power and punch as a Catholic school leadership program. But I have a feeling that Tony and I might be willing to assist you with that. Tony, is that right?
Absolutely. We had a question in the previous session that somewhat is responsive to this question that you've asked, that you've conveyed to us, Kate. A person asked the question, well, I have a vice principal that is doing a very good job, and I've spoken to this person about taking on, a principal's position in the diocese, and the vice principal says no. Well, we don't know why. It could be that they have family commitments. There's a lot of different variables that enter into that decision that someone is making. But sometimes the person is observing the amount of work that a Catholic school, elementary or secondary school principal does in their life, and they may be looking at that amount of work and the response to that amount of work by that principal as not being a way of life that they want to pursue. So an idea that a superintendent could engage in, or what a diocese could engage in, is certainly, I'm sure that the Catholic elementary school principals meet together in solidarity at retreats. But how is that witness of joy in leadership given back to the people collectively as the teachers who are in the positions to become future leaders of the school, of their schools? So how is that modeling given back to them, that it's not just drudge and stress and pain, but rather a life-giving experience despite all of the work that we put in, but a life-giving experience in serving the church and serving a greater mission in life. So how is that communicated back through the diocese as given that model to teachers who recognize Catholic school principles that they're serving with now as people to be modeled in their behavior? So that's another thought that superintendents and a diocese can engage in. How are they affirming this back to the teacher in the classroom that this is a worthy place to be in their lives in the future of Catholic education?
And one final thought, if I may, along those lines, is that while Tony says, it's not all drudgery, sometimes it is. And we both have short memories because we've both been involved at universities for 7 years or so. But when we were in the administration business at the secondary level, I was secondary. Tony, you were elementary or secondary?
Both.
Both,
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we know that there are times of great stress and great pressure, and you may really look, like the Walking Dead as you walk around at some points along the way. Perhaps the Archdiocese or the diocese could offer some kind of an experience for the principals and for the heads of schools that would be of a more relaxed nature, even if it were only for a day and a half. If they were able to do something like that one a year to help them to reestablish balance, to get back on their pace again, and to have that more relaxed look that Tony is talking about, that might be a help as well. Now, that's parenthetical to the original question, but I think it's a good point.
And maybe one final question.
Anything else, Kate?
Yeah, this is from the audience, maybe some of the folks who are sitting in the audience today is, how would one identify or know if he or she is fit to be a principal? Do you have any characteristics or thoughts or emotions that people might reflect on there?
So somebody who's contemplating leadership, and what are they engaging in terms of this idea of self-awareness and self-reflection and self-assessment? Interesting question. Mary, do you want to start with that one?
Well, I think the first thing, in my opinion, would be how committed is the person to quality Catholic education. And that means the faith component, certainly, in modeling the faith and service and so on, but it also means providing the quality instructional leadership that has to take place in the school. Are they prepared to do that? Are they prepared to surround themselves with other leaders who will fill in any areas that are not strengths for them? Because nobody has all the strengths. We have to surround ourselves with other people who can do the things that we're not necessarily the best at. A third thing would be an honest consideration of how well do I handle stress? What does it do to me? Do I suffer from it physically? Do I suffer from it psychically? Or am I able to balance it out? Another question might be, how much support do I have in my life? I consider my family, my friends, other educators, certainly any spiritual support that a person may get. All those factors, I think, are important. And how physically fit do I keep myself? I know that doesn't sound so very important, but I think it's very important, because to be a healthy person, you've got to have that healthy body. So how physically fit do I keep myself? Do I make sure I get enough sleep and rest, which renovates the brain? And how important is that to me? Those are the initial things that I would suggest that people think about when they're considering leadership. And remember that you don't have to do it all. Other people are there to help. Okay, Tony.
Yeah, I would agree on every one of those points, and I would add one element, and we've already discussed it in our PowerPoint, and that is visioning. Mm-hmm. Ask yourself if you're that type of person, or do you strictly live in the moment? And that's not a bad thing to live in the moment, but leaders are always thinking about what can be. We use in Jesuit education, we think about Ignatian spirituality as magis. What more can be done? So if you're a person like that, if you're a person who thinks about visioning the future of what the possibilities are, that's another key quality, because that's what people want to know when you become the leader of the school. What is your vision for us, and where are you going to be taking us?
Okay, great.
Kate, I think we're done, huh?
We are. Thank you so much. And certainly you've invited folks to send you notes of questions that may come up after the fact to your email addresses. Okay.
Right. Email address is right here. We would love to hear from you.
Great. Well, I want to thank Dr. Sabatino and Sister Fitzgerald so much for all that they have shared with us on this very important topic. And I also like to thank you as well for spending your time with us this evening. As a reminder, we will be sending you this recorded webinar and presentation slides in another day or two by email. Thank you again, and may you enjoy a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.